I'm sure that this past week has been a week filled with traditions in our lives. We've had the week of Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving is a day of tradition in our country, filled with all kinds of associated traditions that we have. Central to that is turkey. For most people, turkey instantly comes to our mind when we think of Thanksgiving. Although I do know that for at least a few of you, not having turkey is your tradition, because you don't like the bird, so you have something else instead. But turkey is still what image comes to most of our minds, along with all the expected sides that go with turkey. We have mashed potatoes and gravy, you have the obligatory stuffing, you have cranberries, all those things. In my family growing up, one of the side dishes that always made an appearance on Thanksgiving was a sweet potato marshmallow casserole thing. And part of the tradition was not just this casserole, it was the debate as to whether any man around the table would consider this an edible side or not, because the men prided themselves on not having that, and the ladies would give them a hard time. That was part of the tradition. There's other traditions with Thanksgiving. We have desserts. They're part of it. Pumpkin pie is the classic. Of course, again, you've got many that will have other substitutes that form their family tradition. In my house growing up, it was pumpkin pie, but part of the tradition was to tease my father that he could only have his pumpkin pie with a pile of whipped cream on top. My father loved pumpkin pie. He despises whipped cream. So the debate would, well, you only get it one way. Naps, that's part of the tradition for many. Football games, maybe naps during football games, those were all part of Thanksgiving traditions for people. For some of you, it might be Black Friday early jump. You know, as more and more stores are open on Thanksgiving, you have to get out there for Black Friday. Joe saying, no way. I'm with Joe. Not part of my tradition, but many of you have these kind of traditions, and I'd imagine that most of us enjoyed several of these. Maybe some of us endured a few of them, but we enjoyed our traditions around the week of Thanksgiving. They play a lot of what makes the week special. As we'll see in our text today, however, there are times when traditions can get in the way rather than serve as a positive element in our lives. Last week, we wrapped up Luke chapter 13 in our series Through the Gospel. We were reminded, as Luke finished this chapter, that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's been heading in that direction, at least conceptually, since the end of chapter 9. Still, after several chapters of meandering travel that he's undertaken, Luke reminds us here at the end of chapter 13, Jerusalem is still the goal. That's the overall plan, and that plan has not changed. Jesus heading towards Jerusalem where he knows the cross awaits. Sadly, even though Jesus is heading toward the cross to complete God's plan of redemption, we've seen many religious leaders failing to recognize that truth. The men that should be the first to be able to identify Jesus as the Messiah, they're the ones that aren't recognizing him. They are rejecting him. They should see that the actions he's undertaken, the things he's able to do, along with the teaching he's made, those are clear signs that he is the Messiah that they claim they've been waiting for. And yet, they see him as someone who's disrupting their way of life. Someone who's messing up their traditions. So rather than embracing him, largely the religious leaders have urged the people in the regions to reject him. Last week we were a little surprised when we did see some Pharisees actually warn Jesus about Herod Antipas, who was trying to kill him. That was an exception to the norm. One episode does not change the fact that overall the leaders have been rejecting Jesus. The scribes, the Pharisees, they're rejecting him. And this morning, we're going to see this overall rejection of Jesus come flaring back as Jesus once again encounters a group of hostile religious leaders. We'll see this hostility centers around a common theme from earlier confrontations. They have these strongly held traditions, and Jesus is messing with those. Let's go ahead and read our text this morning. We're looking at the first 6 verses of chapter 14 in Luke. It happened that when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely. And there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they kept silent. And he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day?" And they could make no reply to this. This morning, it's important that we understand what is going on here in these verses before we try to extract the lesson that can apply to us today. The context is very different, so we need to make sure we know what's happening. Once again, we have a conflict here between tradition and compassion. Those are the two sides of the equation we're dealing with, tradition and compassion. What I plan to do is discuss each of these based on the conflict we see. In the first set of verses, verse 1 through really the first part of verse 4, we have the tradition side of the conflict. The tradition, no work on the Sabbath. That's the tradition. The Sabbath was the religious day that they honored where they were setting apart for worship. The tradition was no work on that day. Now, like several events that Luke has given us, he once again does not tell us when or where this particular event happened. The thing that mattered most is that these verses happen on the Sabbath. This is the 4th time that Luke has specifically recorded a controversy coming up on the Sabbath. There were 2 of the times in chapter 6, and we had one controversy come up in chapter 13, all prior to this one now. This is number 4. This time, the controversy erupts when Jesus is invited to dinner with some religious leaders. Well, that invitation alone is a little surprising, that religious leader would invite Jesus to his house to have a meal. And we're told that it's to his house because the meal takes place in the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. Even that expression is a little surprising. The expression leader of the Pharisees is sometimes used for members of the Sanhedrin. So it's possible that's the case here. The Sanhedrin, they were the religious ruling council of the Jews. They were the leaders as far as the Jews were concerned of their nation. And this term was used for that group. So it's possible that's the case here. At any rate, this man is influential in his community. He is a leader. And he's invited Jesus to his house for a meal. That's surprising as well, that he'd be invited to dinner in the man's house, because we need to remember, dinner in their culture is an act of friendship. It's a function of fellowship, an expression of close fellowship. This man invited Jesus for a dinner. He also invited other men. Obviously, Jesus is not the only one there because there's others, people dining with them on this particular Sabbath. And as we look here, it's just as clear that the man and the other friends he's invited, they do not consider Jesus as a friend. Even though they're sitting down to have dinner, even though he's going through the traditional custom of offering dinner, they don't consider Jesus a friend because we're told the other guests, at least several of the guests, Luke doesn't make it clear if it's everyone, but says they were watching him closely. Their purpose is not to get to know Jesus. They're not there having dinner around the table with Jesus so they can build a relationship with him. Their purpose is to observe him. They want to catch him in something, a fault of some kind that they can use against him, something they could exploit in their hostility toward Jesus. Luke gives us all these background details in verse 1 before telling us that Jesus isn't the only surprising person to find at the table. Seated right across from Jesus is another unexpected guest, a man with dropsy. Now, remember, Luke is a physician. Luke likes to give us medical details, but that doesn't mean that we know exactly what this man is suffering from. We use different medical terms today, and our medical terms have a little more precision than they had in Luke's day. What we've translated here as dropsy is probably some sort of edema, a chronic swelling of some kind, but beyond that, it's impossible to get to a precise understanding what condition this man had. Still, the one thing that we can say for sure is that there would be no doubt that this man had a condition. It was a very visible condition, a visible swelling type condition. There is no question that there's a physical problem because it's visibly obvious. This was something that could not be hidden, and the man is seated right across from Jesus. The man's obvious physical problem makes it hard, really, to read verse 2 without wondering in our minds, was this man invited and seated across from Jesus as a sort of trap? Remember, it is the Sabbath. 2 of the 3 Sabbath controversies we've seen before this one has happened because Jesus healed on the Sabbath. They came up because Jesus healed on the Sabbath. Now Luke never states it directly, but informs us that most of the guests are watching Jesus closely. And then lo and behold, here's this other guest right across from Jesus. They're watching him, and Jesus has a man who clearly needs help right in front of him. That sounds like a trap to me. Makes me wonder, what will Jesus do? Which is precisely the question that Luke seems to want to have in our minds. What will Jesus do? Look at the text carefully. Luke has not recorded anyone saying a word all the way through the end of verse 2. No one has spoken yet, at least not the way Luke has recorded it, let alone has anyone asked any questions. Yet in verse 3, Jesus answers the lawyers and the Pharisees. Either there are implied questions in their actions, or there are thoughts bouncing around in their heads that Jesus knows about. Luke has worked here to draw us into the thoughts of everyone there. All the people sitting around that table, they're wondering, what is Jesus going to do with this man sitting right across from him who needs help? Help that they know Jesus can provide because he's done it before. He's healed people. The entire room is wondering, will Jesus heal this man who so obviously needs healing? Jesus answers their implied question with the question. Look at what Jesus says. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Is it lawful? Is it legal to heal on the Sabbath or not? Now, we were just told that there's lawyers and Pharisees sitting there. Lawyers, as we've seen in other parts of the gospel, those are the men who are experts on the Mosaic law. Pharisees, those were the men who pride themselves on carefully following the Mosaic law. And Jesus asks a question here about lawfulness. Is it legal to heal on the Sabbath or not? This question is right in the wheelhouse of the dinner guests. This is their domain. Yet what do they do with the question? Verse 4, they kept silent. They didn't even take a swing at this fastball that came right down the center of the plate. It's their world. And they don't say a word. Now, to understand what's going on with the rest of our text, we need to understand why they kept silent. We need to understand why Jesus' question perfectly cuts right between these two groups that were just identified, lawyers and Pharisees. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? This question forces these two groups to just stare at each other across the table, because they know that each group was wired to answer this question differently. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? The lawyers around the table, they would feel forced to answer this question as, yes, it's legal. There were a lot of Sabbath regulations listed out in the Mosaic Law, but there's not a single stipulation in the law that explicitly forbids healing on the Sabbath. And the lawyers around the table, they pride themselves on knowing all these little nuances. They could cite verse and reference faster than anybody. They could cite exactly what it says. And there's no law that says do not heal on the Sabbath. Yet at the same time, there's extensive legal precedents that suggested that it's considered unlawful to heal on the Sabbath. There's been traditions that developed around the interpretation of the Mosaic Law. Remember, the Pharisees, they pride themselves on living within all these traditions. They are the ultimate law keepers, at least in their mind. And the law does state, one of the stipulations, as we've stated, as you have on screen, is that the law said, do not work on the Sabbath. In fact, all the controversies that have come up deal with this working on the Sabbath. So we've seen it before. Centuries of tradition have developed around trying to find what is the legal precedents that define work. The law says do not work. What is work? And over the centuries of tradition, clarifying what has entailed work or not, healing on the Sabbath lands in the category of things that run counter to the traditions. It's a little too much effort put forth. For that reason, the Pharisees, they're wired to answer this question of lawfulness regarding healing on the Sabbath with a no. And they could point to extensive precedents to support that no. Now, of course, no one wants to have an internal debate in front of an outsider. The lawyers and the Pharisees, they'd have this debate all day long. Is it lawful or not for this particular thing? What defines work? They love those kind of debates. In private, not in front of an outsider. And Jesus is an outsider because he's disrupting both of them. So if either group around the table were to offer up an answer to Jesus' question, the other group would be forced to respond and the debate would begin. Both groups know that. And for that reason, no one breaks the silence. Even the lawyers would agree that it doesn't hurt to take a more restrictive view of work and just avoid it. And let's not forget, both groups seem to be there with the goal of trapping Jesus, not each other. They could agree that the long-standing tradition should remain upheld whether it was absolutely legally required or not. Precedence was sufficient. No work on the Sabbath. No healing on the Sabbath. That's the tradition that we see in our text this morning. No work on the Sabbath. Now let's consider the other side of the equation, the compassion. The compassion, an act of mercy on the Sabbath. You know, when I read this, I wonder, what kind of expression did Jesus have on his face in verse 4? My imagination can run in two different directions, and I don't know which would be the right one. I can easily imagine Jesus as he reaches across the table for the man who needs healing, not looking at the man, but looking at all the other people in the room. All the other people sit around the table. I can see him looking at them and with a look of disdain. Jesus knows what they're thinking. He knows how they're holding on to their traditions, yet none of them have the courage to answer his question. I can imagine that the disgust he has at this moment might at least register in his eyes as he looks around at them. At the same time, I can just as easily imagine Jesus ignoring all of them and focusing only on the man that he's about to heal as he reaches across the table. In that case, I imagine Jesus would have a look of compassion, an expression of love, of mercy in his eyes. The compassion of his heart would show on his face as he looks at this man he's about to heal. Luke doesn't tell us. Either way, he doesn't answer the question that my imagination raises, but he does tell us that Jesus reaches across the table, he takes hold of the man, and he heals him. As always, when Jesus heals, it's a complete work. The healing was instantaneous, it was complete, and Jesus immediately sends the man away. Whether the meal is finished or not, this man has received more from this dinner than he could have ever hoped to receive. Jesus sends him away. Jesus does want this man around for the confrontation that's about to unfold, where the people around the table were trying to use this man. The confrontation is between Jesus and the leaders. This man's been used as a prop in their game long enough, so Jesus dismisses him. It's time for Jesus to leave so he can confront the other men, the leaders who are trying to use this man in his condition for their own purposes. The man leaves, and Jesus immediately poses a second question. Essentially, Jesus says, if there's something of value, if you have something of value, say a son or an ox, although I know some manuscripts have a donkey and an ox instead of a son, but if you have something of value and it falls into a well, will you not conduct a rescue even if it's on the Sabbath? Now, by using this question, Jesus is appealing to their own procedures, their own established precedents. Jesus is pointing out something that all of the men sitting around the table would agree to, the lawyers and the Pharisees. They all agreed that under certain circumstances, prioritization of legal matters is required. The rescue of a trapped person, or the rescue of a trapped animal, that was an accepted exception to the legal rule of not working. There was precedence for that went back centuries. If a person or an animal fell into the well, there was no question that it would take real work to conduct a rescue. The rescue might require tools, which legally, by their understanding of work, you couldn't use on the Sabbath. The rescue could require lifting great weight. Again, that's work. It might require walking or even running great distances to get the tools and the help that's needed to conduct the rescue. There was no doubt that a rescue would require doing things that were normally and even reasonably classified as work. Work that was disallowed on the Sabbath by the law that says not to work on the Sabbath. Yet they all agreed that saving life was more important than the command to avoid work. There are circumstances where priorities have to be made. In the case of a needed rescue, mercy was required. Compassion for a life demanded it. The law had to be set aside in that case so that mercy could be administered. Everyone sitting around the table, the lawyers, the Pharisees, they all agreed on this principle and the way it was used with the Mosaic Law. Frankly, this is still the way law is interpreted. We think this way as well. We all recognize that we know there's a speed limit on Ryan Road, and if we break that speed limit by a significant amount and we see a police officer, we expect that we will be pulled aside and our reward for breaking the speed limit will be a ticket. We know that, right? We expect that. That's the law. But we also know that if we are forced into a case where we are taking a medical emergency to the hospital in our car, someone's had a heart attack and we have to take them in our car for some reason, and we're exceeding speed limit and a police officer comes to learn that's what we're doing, rather than a ticket, we probably will get a police escort. Because the law is set aside for the extremity of the crisis. Well, Jesus has clearly performed an act of mercy. He's healed a man who suffered a severe difficulty for some time. Yes, it was the Sabbath, but their own exception allows for rescues on the Sabbath. He's demonstrated that. He's shown that the Sabbath is no reason to withhold mercy. In fact, compassion demands mercy, doesn't it? That's the implied question that Jesus is posing here in verse 5. Doesn't compassion demand mercy on the Sabbath? And now the men are trapped. If the men sitting around the table were silent before Jesus showed compassion, well, they certainly can't answer now. You know, before Jesus healed the man, the question they posed is really in that what we'd call an academic realm. It's that coffee room conversation. Can you heal on Sabbath or not? We can debate that. But if they couldn't answer that question, how can they respond now when he's shown real compassion to a person in great need? They could make no reply to this. That's verse 6. They could make no reply to this. That verse is more interesting than we might notice in our English translations. In the original Greek, Luke uses stronger language for the silence here in verse 6 than he used back in verse 4. He seems to make the point that if there was no response possible in verse 4, Jesus' logic is so sound that the lawyers and Pharisees cannot possibly give a response now. They are trapped by Jesus' compassion. They set out to trap him, but instead they find themselves trapped by compassion. Furthermore, Luke actually writes here in verse 6, they could make no reply to these things, plural, rather than no reply to this, singular. If you have a King James or an English Standard Version, they translate it in the plural, these things. Luke is not suggesting that the people could not answer verse 5, but they could not answer the larger topic of the Sabbath issue overall. What is proper on the Sabbath? They could not answer Jesus' challenges about their love of tradition. They could not answer his challenges to show compassion. They could not answer his challenge to the proper position of the law itself. Jesus has been challenging religious leaders on these topics now for months, showing them that they're holding on to their own traditions rather than showing the compassion that God requires. And as a result of holding on to their own traditions, they're rejecting the Messiah. The very Messiah that they claim that they're the ones leading the nations to look for. And Luke seems to have all this in mind as he summarizes that these leaders could not reply to these things. They are challenging Jesus. They're challenging Jesus because they reject him as the Messiah. And again, Jesus has shown himself to be the Messiah. He is Lord of the Sabbath. And as such, as Lord of Sabbath, he's shown himself to be a man of true compassion. One who shows mercy and compassion on the Sabbath. Of course, we know the rest of the story, so we know Jesus is a man of compassion. We know that because he's on his way to the cross. He's headed to give his life in the ultimate act of compassion for the sin debt of you and I. Even the men sitting around that table could take advantage of the sacrifice he's to make on the cross. All that's required is faith in him. Yet their traditions are calling them to fail to recognize the compassion that he offers. Are we any better? Are we any better? We've seen the tradition. No work on the Sabbath. We've seen the compassion, an act of mercy on the Sabbath. What we still need to do this morning is we need to put this all together so that we can apply it to our own lives. What we need to do is see the lesson in the text. The lesson. We must emphasize compassion over tradition. That's the lesson. We must emphasize compassion over tradition. I'm sure that none of us here this morning want to think of ourselves as being like the lawyers and the Pharisees in this story. We want to be like Jesus, right? Our goal is to be like Jesus. We don't want to be like Jesus' enemies. Yet, I fear that we're naturally more prone to be like them than we are to be like Jesus. It's far more natural for us to hold on to our traditions than it is for us to show compassion, let alone emphasize compassion. Why do I say that it's so hard for us to give up our traditions and emphasize compassion? Well, I say that for the simple reason that Luke, under divine inspiration, mind you, Luke was inspired in everything he recorded. Luke keeps repeating this message in the stories that he includes in his gospel. Jesus had approximately 3 years of public ministry. We know that. Well, if you do the math, that converts into more than 150 Sabbaths. While Jesus was ministering, he had 150 Sabbaths. Yet of all those possible Sabbath experiences, Luke records 4 times that Jesus faced controversy on the Sabbath because religious leaders held on to their traditions so tightly. We know practically nothing about any of the other Sabbaths. But we know these 4, and they're all 4 dealing with the same thing. Now, when I preach through Luke to this point, I combined 2 of these controversies into one sermon, 2 that are in the first part of Luke 6. I took those in a single sermon, but I was telling Aaron and Michael this week that I feel like I preached this message now 3 times because it's the same message. When I preached about the Sabbath issues in Luke 6, I worded the main idea as we must hold traditions loosely to hold loyalty to Christ tightly. That was the lesson through Luke 6:11-1. Maybe you can give me the next slide there. I worded it this way: Luke 6:11-1. There's 2 stories there of Sabbath controversies. I grouped them together since they're listed next to each other, but they were 2 separate Sabbaths, 2 separate controversies, one dealing with a healing. Then, when we preached about the Sabbath controversy in Luke 13, at just the beginning of this month, I worded the main idea as the spiritual well-being of others should rank as our highest concern. Today, I'm wording the idea as we must emphasize compassion over tradition. Still, all that means is that I've tried to find various ways to express the same idea. The issue in every case is one of holding on to traditions rather than showing compassion to others. The idea is repeating itself in our series because Luke is repeating the idea. That means after tonight, we will have talked about these concepts 2 times in our life groups in 1 month because we hit Luke 13:10-17 the first week of November. So twice in 1 month we're dealing with the same issue. That's a lot of repetition. Yet it's not repeated by accident. God knows what we need. God moved Luke to record what we need. And Luke repeats this message through these events because God knows us. We are far more like the religious leaders than we want to admit. Certainly more than we want to accept. Is it possible that the first time when we heard this message, we ignored the implications for us? Is it possible that the second time we heard this message, we resisted the implications for us? What will we do with it now the third time we hear it? Will we reject it? That is the question that we need to ask ourselves today. That's the question that I urge us to wrestle with today. We must emphasize compassion over tradition. What traditions are we holding on to that hinder our ability to show compassion? We need to ask ourselves that and give honest answers, hard answers. We live in a society that is as hopeless as it has ever been. Studies have shown that people feel more disconnected from other people after 2020 than they ever have before in our country. People are isolated. They are lonely. The current generation that's just now moving into adulthood, called Generation Z, the ones that are moving out of teens into adulthood, they are being identified as the loneliest generation ever. They may have hundreds of online friends, but they don't have a single person that in their life that they can share their life burdens with. Online, all they can do is shape their profile so that they look like everything's wonderful. This is a generation that needs our compassion. And sadly, if we go from Generation Z all the way to the few remaining members of the greatest generation, we find that every generation is facing increased issues. There are people all around us who need our compassion. People all around us who need a friend who can introduce them to their greatest need, a Lord and a Savior. The need is great. It's all around us. In fact, even in this church, there are people who are hurting and need compassion. So let's ask ourselves, are we meeting the need that God has placed around us? Are we sharing Christ with those who need His hope? Are we sharing compassion with those who need a friend? And if not, why not? It's not for a lack of need. What is keeping us from doing what we're called to do by the example that our Savior gives us in our text this morning? What is hindering us? Much of the time, the answer really is our fear. We fear other people. But you know what we do with our fear? We wrap our fears in traditions. Traditions that gives it a nice painted look. We need to hold others at bay by traditions so that we can excuse the fact that we are not doing what Christ calls us to do. This morning, we need the Spirit to convict us. We need the Spirit to convict us of our sin of failure. We need to see where we are sinfully selfish, where we are fearful of others, and we have used traditions to hide behind. What we need is the Spirit to show us that we, using the words of verse 6, have no reply for our failures. We need the Spirit to point out why we are silent when we should be bold. And then we need the Spirit to transform us. Transform us with compassion that overflows from the great understanding of the compassion that we receive from the Lord who gives all compassion, as we've seen in our text this morning. We must emphasize compassion over tradition. This past week has been a wonderful, wonderful week of tradition. Traditions that have been wrapped around a holiday. We've had family and friends, and we can relish those traditions. But I pray that we will also today find ourselves challenged to examine other traditions that we have that are preventing us from showing the compassion to the people who desperately need it. We must emphasize compassion over tradition. Father, I pray today that you would do a work in our lives. You've placed this text before us today. You've caused us to look at it because you've given it to us. And now, Father, I pray that your Spirit would use it to provoke us, to show us where we need to be transformed, where we are holding on to tradition, much like the religious leaders of Jesus' day, rather than showing the compassion of our Lord to those who need it. Father, open our eyes. Remove our blindness to our own failures and transform us to be like Christ. For it's in his name I pray. Amen.